Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for standing by, and welcome to today's webinar, Unlocking the Cloud Operating Model for Provisioning. In today's webinar, we'll walk through the process, tools, and use cases required in the transition from infrastructure to cloud. My name is Caroline Guo, and I'll be helping facilitate today's webinar. For the folks on the audience, this webinar is actually a continuation of our Cloud Operating Model webinar series. If this is the first webinar or the first time that you're learning about the cloud operating model, feel free to take a look at our other resources on our HashiCorp.com/resources page for additional cloud operating model webinar recordings or white papers and more. The links for all those resources will also be shared at the end of this presentation. Please feel free to type any of your questions out during the webinar in the question box. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available after post-processing, usually within a couple of business days. Before we actually get started, I did want to run a quick poll just to better understand our audience on the line here today. So here we go. And let's share the results. So the question was, what are your biggest challenges with cloud adoption? It looks like majority of folks said multi-cloud strategy. Second was compliance and management, and then self-service infrastructure and initial cloud migration. Very interesting. Okay. And then one other final question, just to understand how many of the folks have used Terraform. Okay, it looks like majority yes, with around 30% have not. Okay, great. That gives us a lot of good insight just going into the presentation. So with that said, our speaker today is Megan Lees, Product Marketing Manager for Terraform. And I'm gonna pass it over to Megan to get started with our webinar today.
All right, thanks, Caroline. I'm just going to move over to share the screen. Oop. There we go. All right.
Perfect.
There we go. Thank you for joining the webinar today, Unlocking the Cloud Operating Model for Provisioning. This is, I believe, the third one in a series of 4 that we'll be having. So check out the other ones if you weren't able to attend. If you were able to attend, hopefully you'll see some consistency across this. But today we'll be focusing on provisioning, and that's specific around our Terraform product. So let me just introduce myself real quick. My name is Megan Lees. I've been working with HashiCorp for a couple of years now, and my current focus is on Terraform and its presence in the market and just how we kind of talk with the different organizations that are looking for their multi-cloud strategy. I have GitHub, I have LinkedIn, I'm a little bit on Twitter, but mostly those are where you'll see me out and about. So anyway, if you'd like to find me, that's a good place to start. All right, so the agenda for today is we're going to introduce HashiCorp, just who are we as a company and how did we get started. Then we're going to go into the macro trends that are actually driving this transition to a cloud operating model. And as I saw, a lot of people are interested in just multi-cloud strategies. That's a big part of what we'll be talking about. We'll introduce Terraform and its approach to cloud infrastructure automation and its place in the cloud operating model. We'll move into then the use cases that organizations within the Global 2000, Fortune 500 have really been focused on solving for. And then the last part, we'll do a Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and enter those into the chat, as Caroline had previously said. All right, to get started, HashiCorp was founded in 2012. We have 2 founders, Arman Dagard and Mitchell Hashimoto. Those were our founders. They actually started a number of open source projects that started with Vagrant and Packer. And the focus for them always was around how can we automate infrastructure that goes between the operations teams and the application development teams. So how can we automate every kind of workflow that happens between those 2 teams? So it started with Vagrant and Packer. It evolved onto Terraform, which was just like, how can I spin up and spin down my resources. Vault around security, Console that was around connecting the services as things moved into like a microservice based orientation, and then Nomad around how easeability and letting developers deploy their applications. So these are the 6 open source projects. That was how it started. These were just 2 founders kind of obsessed with automation. You'll hear them talk about that, but really just trying to solve problems they were experiencing being in operations and development at some software companies. As that evolved, they started working with some of the organizations that were using the open source projects that ultimately then led to more complex challenges around how can we use this open source in our companies and solve for more of the concerns at scale. So over the last 7 years, the company has grown from those few individuals who started it to over 700 employees with a pretty good backing of funding to help us grow out the organizations to, provide support, field enablement teams, sales, our internal teams, lots of engineering resources. All right, so the thing that we like to look at here at HashiCorp is really, it all starts with the challenges that we're trying to solve for. And in order to understand the challenges, you have to step back and actually understand what are the trends that are driving them. And this is not going to be any surprise to anyone on here, but it is a good level set. So the big thing is there's a huge pressure on organizations to deliver applications. And these are organizations that weren't traditionally software companies, right? You're thinking about how do you go and shop at Home Depot or Target, or how do you engage with your friends now through social media? And these are all the things that are changing the way both us as consumers behave, but also how organizations run their businesses. So transitioning the operations of the business from some of their traditional methods to now be very software focused. And this also then forces a change on the infrastructure that's actually underpinning those operations for the company. So as we think about, hey, what is that workflow to deliver the applications? The organizations are also thinking about, hey, what is the workflow that actually underpins how I deliver my infrastructure out to my application teams? And there's really 3 major things that we see that are changing. Volume and distribution of services, and we'll go into this a little bit more as we look about the cloud operating model, but really just think high level, like, hey, I had hundreds or maybe thousands of servers in my contained private data center, where now I may have hundreds or thousands of servers on any given different day that expand up or down, depending on the needs of the application. Then we look at how services are spun up and how long they live. We had this ability to say, hey, I'm going to deliver services to my application team, and those are going to live for months at a time for the duration of the project. And then they're going to be spun down and reallocated to a new team, and they live for long periods of time. And we relied on this ticketing system between software teams and our operations teams. And now that's kind of changing, where we go and we say, hey, we're going to spin up services now multiple times a day or maybe multiple times a week, depending on the needs. And we've moved now to this more like self-service platform for how services are managed. And then obviously we have a lot of choice now, where we had these kind of standardized topologies of configurations in our private data centers. We're now moving to these models where we have multiple cloud providers, we have private data center infrastructure, you have tons and tons of cloud services that have specialized offerings, and that just gives a lot of variety and configurations that may change on a regular basis. So these 3 things are really like the core of what's shifting in the way we think about the infrastructure. But as we kind of look at it, it's really about what is this cloud operating model that we're looking at. So think about kind of this traditional data center that we've had, where we had that dedicated infrastructure that we talked about, and there's this shift now. So we're not actually getting rid of completely the private data center. Maybe we've shifted it to a private cloud, but we're now extending to what is our public cloud providers. And most organizations that we've worked with, they think about it like this: hey, I have my private data center. We do need to expand into the cloud to address the need to move faster, and the cloud will allow us to do that. So they adopt their first cloud. This might be AWS or Azure, GCP. You can see all those on there. There's 5 or 6 that we hear very commonly adopted across the global 2000, but they start with kind of one, and it might be moving a set of applications to cloud, or it might be deploying evergreen applications into cloud or new types of applications there. So this is kind of that first phase. So you have whatever is in your private data center, and this might be where you still maintain the systems of record, to then moving or deploying workloads in cloud that represent these new systems of engagement, who the consumers are actually interacting with. These might be the applications that, like on Black Friday after Thanksgiving, need a lot of compute. And so they just really high consumption of cloud. And then on February 15th, after the holiday season, we spin a lot of that stuff down and they become a lot more mild. So those are kind of those systems of engagement. But this is what that model kind of looks like. It's like private cloud, adopt your first cloud. As other clouds start to have other services, maybe acquisitions of other companies come, we see the second cloud, the third cloud come. And what most organizations are kind of determining up front is like, hey, as we go down this path, and we saw a lot of people on the poll say this, is like, we need to have a strategy to adopt any of this infrastructure at any time, to enable ourselves to have a strategy that is multi-cloud, that is multi-provider, and we're not going to be locked out. And this is kind of where HashiCorp views the primary value of our software in terms of the cloud operating model. So this is like the high level view of our distributed kind of dynamic clouds. But let's kind of decompose this into the actual layers of the operating model. So there's really 4 core layers of infrastructure. There's the base layer, which is around what are the core services I'm provisioning, and that's where we're going to focus today with Terraform. And as we think about this, who are the ones engaging, who are the owners of this core infrastructure, and you're very focused on your operations team. Who is the team that's chartered with the cloud strategy and actually has to go and implement the resources or standardize those resources out. The second layer is around security. So how am I ensuring security across the entire multiple data centers and clouds? And this is where we have our operating model for security. That was a previous webinar. And then connecting. So traditionally we relied on these host-based static IPs to connect everything together. And now we're relying on very dynamic service-based networking to happen. And that's where our product console is in play. And then that final piece is really at the runtime layer. It's like, how do you take pools of infrastructure that you've provisioned with Terraform and actually deploy applications intelligently across them? And this is a place where you see Kubernetes playing. And then also we have a product, Nomad, which pivots a little bit, because instead of just doing container stuff, it can actually deploy your workloads, your traditional workloads that you have in your private data center, along with any containerized or anything else. All right, so these are the 4 layers of infrastructure, and at each of these layers, there's also then the challenges that are presented. So as we look at Terraform here at the bottom, the major challenges that the operations team is looking to address is, we were going from a set of dedicated infrastructure that lived for long periods of time and was relatively homogeneous or had validated sets of configurations that were approved, to something that's like capacity on demand. It could be any sets of capacity at any time and many, many different providers. So this navigating this transition ultimately then has us looking at what are the right ways to do that. And a big piece of that is infrastructure automation, because you're provisioning a lot more frequently and you're provisioning a lot of different types of infrastructure. So we go from maybe vCenter or some of our GUI-based tools where we managed our dedicated or our private data centers, to an array of different options that go across different cloud providers. So Terraform is often used to get up and running with maybe one set of infrastructure, but then there's a variety of other things. AWS offers cloud formations, Azure offers the ARM resource manager, GCP has their own deployment manager, and there's just a variety of other infrastructure offerings and cloud management platforms. So what this ultimately leads to is then a variety of different workflows, a variety of different processes, different teams, and different tools being used. And this is kind of a very fragmented approach to the operating model. So our goal with Terraform and the way it was built was to ultimately provide a model that laid the foundation for cloud infrastructure automation that could be used for any infrastructure. Everything is then based on infrastructure as code, and this is for both provisioning and then also compliance in the cloud operating model. As we discussed in the beginning, Terraform is an open source project, so there is a way to get started with it where you can just download the software and actually go out and use the Terraform providers to provision infrastructure today if you wanted to. I know we had a number of people that were interested, had not started using it. And so that's the beautiful thing about how people get started, is they can just kind of go out, they can provision, a set of resources, deploy maybe a small application onto it and just try it out. But the main fundamentals behind it really are that everything is as code. So this is all of your resources across different providers, and then all of your policies also. And this is part of what we built with our enterprise product to enable organizations to deploy it. But that's just our standard, is like, hey, everything needs to be an instruction in code. Those are put into then files that get embedded to Terraform to then be run against its automation engine. So Terraform then provides the engine that does a plan and then actually an execution of those instructions. On the bottom part here, you see this is part of the enablement around any infrastructure, is that Terraform open sources providers. Therefore, HashiCorp can create a provider. Any partner or infrastructure provider can also have their own. Community members can create it as well. There's a whole provider development program out there that tells someone, hey, if you want to go be able to have Terraform provision this infrastructure, you can go write a provider or use over 200 of the providers that are available today. And providers all use the cloud or vendor specific APIs to actually go out and call the resources that are defined in the code. The final piece here is that it creates a central source of record for what the infrastructure state is. So, hey, what was the desired code represents the desired state of the resources, and then a state file and audit logs actually represent the actual resources that were provisioned. So if you said, hey, I want to go out and provision VMs in AWS and I want 500 of those, it will give you the state of those 500 VMs. What are the IP addresses? What is that information? From an audit log perspective, it tracks actions. So what was done? When was it done? Who did it? So this becomes then your source of information, which was a bit of a challenge when you think back to what the slide was before, where you have multiple different work streams happening and multiple different approaches to managing the infrastructure. This becomes incredibly fragmented. What is my single source? What is the thing that I have up across all of my data centers? Terraform started off about 4 years ago as an open source project with just a couple thousand downloads. Over time, its popularity has grown and it now reaches just over 100,000 downloads on a weekly basis, depending on some of the new stuff that's out there. And we have about 300 customers, many of those customers, several hundred of those customers actually being in the Global 2000. So this is an approach that is becoming more of a standard on terms of building that multi-cloud strategy. So we're going to actually move forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about the infrastructure as code workflow on the next slide, and then we're going to dive into these two use cases you see here, the multi-cloud compliance and management, and then the second one being the self-service infrastructure. All right, so the guiding principle behind Terraform is infrastructure as code. And the goal is to provide infrastructure automation for any cloud provider or service provider out there. The premise would be, you heard us talk about practitioners, but this could be any individual. It doesn't mean you have to work for a Global 2000 company. You could just be trying to spin up some cloud infrastructure on your own. You could just be trying to automate. But what you do is you define using HCL, HashiCorp configuration language, the resources that you want, and it's in a very simple human readable format that's JSON compatible, and you put that into a Terraform configuration file. There's a number, I'm not going to go into the actual code today, but there's a bunch of resources out there, but you basically say provider X, and I want to provision resources Y and Z within the provider, and this is all like in a human readable format, and then that becomes your Terraform configuration file. One of the things we've done to make it easier for individuals to get started is we have a public module registry. If you go to registry.terraform.io, there's a number of infrastructure as code modules already created. You can import those into your environment, add in your variables, and actually get up and running quite quickly with Terraform. Everything, because this is an infrastructure as code approach, everything can be stored and versioned into version control systems like GitHub, GitLab, whatever your VCS of choice is. And this allows now the same practices that application developers apply to how they write application code now to infrastructure as code. And what we've seen with a lot of organizations is they go from having failure rates of configurations being provisioned of like 10% down to almost 0, because they create these reviewed, validated, and then published infrastructure as code files. And so they know every time, hey, this is going to provision. There's not going to be any failures in this cycle. The extension of this, which we'll get into with the compliance and management piece, is around policy as code. So you can then not only automate your infrastructure provisioning, but also how policies are enforced against that provisioning workflow, and automate it completely so that there's no guess, there's no, hey, did we check this? There's no forgetting that we didn't check a variable or a restriction that was against any of this stuff. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but making sure that everything is automated is very key to being able to rapidly provision in the cloud, but also make sure that you're not breaking anything along the way. And then the final piece of the approach on infrastructure as code is, hey, we want to be able to enable any of these infrastructure providers out there to use Terraform. So Terraform provide automation, but also make sure this automation can be applied to any provider out there, so people don't have to adopt another workflow. They can always just rely on Terraform to go ahead and do that. So the best way to do that is to leverage the variety of providers and partners and community members, and then also HashiCorp employees to help build these providers. So we have over 200 different providers today. That is always growing. We have a team internally that goes through and helps validate a lot of these providers for the popular ones, and those are all available in GitHub and part of the package. All right, so now as we look forward and we take a next step into thinking about the cloud operating model, we've focused on infrastructure as code and enabling organizations to automate the entire experience, have a central source of their infrastructure, and then also be able to use that workflow for any infrastructure. But then the next phase of that is, now that we've enabled everybody in our organization to use Terraform and move quickly, provide automation, how do I make sure that we have a good security posture? How do you make sure that you're not breaking anything that the organization needs to be concerned with for regulatory compliance? And how do we build a model that is operationally consistent, meaning that we have good cost controls in place, that we have good best practices about when infrastructure can be provisioned, and all of those things? How do we keep good track of what infrastructure is being used by different applications? How do we keep track of what infrastructure we're using across different clouds? And these are all concerns that are like day 2, day 3 concerns after you're kind of like already migrated into your first cloud. So let's take a little bit closer look at what are some of the policies we want to be concerned with, because sometimes it's like, hey, we want to make sure we have a good security posture, but we don't really understand what that means at that provisioning layer. So these are some of the top things that we hear kind of organizations want to do. So we'll use these. So one of the things is like, hey, I'm going to go deploy a VM, but we want to make sure that we're only allowing users to provision with a certain application version, because we know other versions have vulnerabilities, they haven't been patched, etc. So how do I restrict what actual software versions can be deployed into onto a VM? And that can be applied in many different ways, but it's basically restricting certain things there. The second one is, how do I maybe restrict resources, storage buckets with public-facing IP addresses? And this one has actually been behind a number of data breaches that have occurred, and it's never malicious. It's usually like, hey, one of my end users, I had a developer, I had someone that went and provisioned the storage bucket, and they didn't know. They didn't know that they had accidentally exposed it on a public-facing network when they did it, and it was there for a couple of days. That one has actually come up, and it's quite common. The next one is around security groups. And then the final one is, how do you create standards of approved infrastructure that can be used? And then restrict that only those sets of infrastructure can be used. So create, in the context of Terraform, create like an infrastructure module, and then lock it down so only those infrastructure or resources that have been approved by the operations team are being used in end user scenarios. Some of the impacts, and I think it's always interesting to kind of go and look at, like, hey, if you're not doing this, what is the impact to the organization? And like I said, that restrict resources with public facing IP addresses, that has actually been the entry point for data breaches for top consulting, telecom, and government organizations. Cybersecurity Insiders detailed all of that. I'm not going to go into the details or call them out because I know a lot of them have taken precautions to fix that and have an operating model in place. But if you want to read more about like what can actually happen and the impact that those little things that happen non-maliciously by employees that are doing kind of their own thing, that's a great place to start. All right. So now we're going to look at compliance. So what are some of the things you want to be concerned with compliance? And this is really around, hey, data sovereignty, making sure your data is being stored where it needs to be stored, so that you're not actually going to expose the organization to fines that aren't unnecessary. So in Europe, they've got GDPR, there's federal organizations that have to comply with FedRAMP, healthcare, and a number of other ones. They have their own regulations, and then PCI regulations as well. These are all different ones that apply to all different organizations, but you can create restrictions that ensure that you're complying with that, hey, data isn't going, or applications aren't going to live on certain infrastructure. You can't provision infrastructure into certain areas that don't comply with these things. So those are around compliance. And then the final one here, and this is a lot of times the biggest one, right? Organizations adopt cloud to move fast. Hey, we want to build our applications faster. It's all around the speed and agility piece. But what then commonly comes up is, now that you've gotten a year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, some of the original companies that went, cloud first multiple years ago are saying, hey, now our challenge is our operating model in terms of cost, our operating model in terms of certain other things. And we need to build in the guardrails that actually create this long-term operating model for cloud, not just what got us there fast today, but how can we enable this operating model to exist for 10 years, 20 years, because this is not going to go away. Cloud is only going to continue to grow for us. And that's kind of where their mindset is. So some of the things that they're concerned with is, how do I ensure that all infrastructure is tagged so that I can go back and inventory what's going on, what applications are using what infrastructure we have running in different places. And this can ultimately inform then business decisions that have to be made at higher levels. How can I restrict that developers are not provisioning the most expensive instance types to do just their development and test phase of application development and run up extra costs during that development lifecycle? How can I restrict provisioning at certain times when there's no one to do approvals or no one to kind of like track what's going on? How can I enforce the use of certain variables that ensure that resources are actually deprovisioned? And one of the examples of this is a time to live variable. And then the final one, and this is one that's become more obvious, is around, how can I restrict infrastructure changes that have huge cost implications? And this is an arbitrary number, but if I provision infrastructure and then the next time I provision that infrastructure, it has it increased to 5x, how do I make restrictions around that? And I think the latest thing that's got people thinking about this is Gartner, CIO, CEO world, a bunch of the outlets out there are talking about how many billions of dollars are being unnecessarily spent on cloud because we don't have the right guardrails in place to help prevent these things. So oversized resources, orphaned resources, just unused resources out there idle over the weekends, those are all contributing to, I think they're saying some of the estimates are around $64 billion in 2020. All right, so multi-cloud compliance and management is like how we think about solving for this. So de-risk security stuff, manage costs systematically, and then all the while still increasing the productivity of the teams. So as we look at this, Terraform uses the concept of a workspace. This is where your infrastructure as code file goes into, any of the variables that you want used within it. That uses the private module registry, so your operations team can write the infrastructure as code, put them in modules. These get validated, they get versioned, they're stored in the private module registry, and these become the foundation of all the workspaces that other teams can then leverage. You send your workspace off to the Terraform automation engine. It does a plan. And then we have what we call Sentinel policy. And this does the policy as code. So compliance teams, security teams, finance teams, operations teams, they can all write their policies as code. Those get stored in TFE and automatically checked every time the infrastructure goes through that provisioning workflow. If it passed the policy checks, it gets applied and it goes out, uses the Terraform providers to actually go and provision the infrastructure on this side. So this is how you build in all of the policies management into the actual automated workflow. All right, so the next thing we're gonna look at is really around self-service infrastructure. And the three things that we really hear organizations talk about as they think about this is obviously enabling developers to provision their infrastructure and work as quickly as possible. But the other ones that they are concerned about is the impact of shadow IT on their organization and the risk that brings out. And then the other one is how can I bring Terraform in and then build it and standardize the adoption of that across the organization. So if other people are using different things, what's the best way for me to come in and say, hey, we believe Terraform infrastructure as code is the best approach for our organization. It allows us to build in policies and to the automated workflow. So how can I go and then enforce that adoption across the organization? And as we all know, that any of you that have brought tools into a company, it's like you can't force people to change. And so what is the best way for me to go ahead and do that, make infrastructure as code to underpin these self-service workflows? All right, so let's just kind of decompose some of those things. So adoption, the best way to standardize infrastructure as code to underpin workflows. There's really three things that we kind of think about. And this is, hey, if you want to drive adoption, Terraform needs to work where your teams are working. And the three big ones we see are people like to work in the CLI within their VCS providers. So work within the VCS workflows. The second one is a lot of teams have built out these DevOps teams, CI/CD workflows. So work within those CI/CD pipelines as well. And then the final one that we often get asked about is, hey, I don't really know infrastructure as code, but we do, because of the goodness that infrastructure as code brings, the automation capabilities, the reduced risk, the reduced failures in builds, we do want it to underpin our cloud management GUIs. And so how can we integrate our Terraform with those GUI-based workflows? So that is our biggest thing, is like, hey, bring infrastructure as code into the workflows that already underpin your teams. The next one is, bringing shadow IT into the light. Don't let it, shadow IT is that when your other teams are out there and they're provisioning infrastructure and you have no idea how they're doing it. So bring that in, have it tracked through the central area, have policy enforced no matter what, and then have a central way of doing audit against it. And then the final one is really make sure the developers are still able to do what they want. So automated ownership and access controls around their own infrastructures that they can go and provision. Have embedded policies that we've talked a lot about that, and then enable within the workflows that they're already using. So as we think about self-service infrastructure, the two things we're really concerned about is making sure that we're reducing risk and then increasing productivity. So a lot of the workflow is very similar to what we saw with Sentinel enforcing policies, workspaces being the source of the code, send that plan, policy check, apply. Now what we've added in is we've added other entry points. So instead of being a developer that has to work right at the CLI or at the code level, you can use what's called a configuration designer to go into Terraform and actually select modules from a kind of GUI-based workflow within Terraform Enterprise. You enter your variables, and then it will go out and build your workspace, and then you can initiate the run, and it'll go initiate the rest of it. So some of the users that don't want to get very familiar with the infrastructure as code can leverage the configuration designer. The other thing we've done is integrated with ITSMs like ServiceNow. So native integrations that allow ServiceNow to be the place where people go in and request services. ServiceNow then connects, builds out workspaces through the use of modules, initiates the workflow, and then returns it back to that actual interface that the user is using. So the goal of self-service infrastructure is really to enable all the workflows that people want to use. So developers can use VCS, they can use CI/CD pipelines. The private module registry is the basis of all of these workflows to create the workspaces, and then the configuration designer or different ITSM interfaces become the way that it can get evangelized out to the rest of the organization. All right, so now as we think forward, there's a lot of things that different organizations are doing, and this has been like the last 12 months for us, is like, hey, it's not just code and then the Terraform engine and then providers, there's a lot of workflow things that people are concerned about doing. And this is really where it like grew into like, hey, let's support the ITSM vendors, let's support more CI/CD vendors, but really around long-term compliance management, cost controls, reporting, those types of things. And so as we look forward to like, what's the next phase of Terraform, it's just continuing to build it out as a platform that can integrate with all of the other workflow partners. This might be compliance partners that we kind of saw there, but it's building it out so that it can be kind of the central source for all of the provisioning needs that you have, and integrating with the other workflows that you need. All right, so as we think about the adoption pattern, like we talked about, infrastructure as code for cloud migration is really that first step. Hey, as you're going to your first cloud, look to Terraform Enterprise as being kind of creating those standards of infrastructure as code configurations to go and do that initial cloud migration. We've talked, there's a number of companies that we've worked with that, you know, they're like, hey, Terraform was really kind of the thing that accelerated us to be able to get into the cloud. It's very consistent, easy to use, modular, concise type of infrastructure as code language that just worked for any provider we wanted to use out there. And that's what kind of unblocked us to getting to that first milestone of cloud migration or cloud adoption. The second part then is like, hey, once we kind of have our initial adoption, we've got that initial set of workloads running in the cloud, how do we then scale that out, get more people in the organization using it, but also build out the policies that are going to ensure we can use it safely and efficiently. So multi-cloud compliance and management tends to be the second use case that we see that enterprises really adopting and accelerating their use of Terraform across their organization. And then that final one is enabling all teams to then use Terraform as their provisioning workflow so that they can self-service infrastructure they need. This might be through the GUI-based portals, it might be through other workflows, but the self-service infrastructure workflow is kind of that full-scale final stage of deployment in terms of Terraform adoption and then the cloud journey. All right, so Terraform's offered in a couple of different packages. We have Terraform Cloud, and I'll have a link at the end if anyone wants to go get started today. But Terraform Cloud has a free offering. You can create an organization. You can get started with up to 5 users, creating infrastructure as code, building modules. You can go and do provisioning runs, remote runs, store state. So it kind of does all of the things you need to do on that first day 1, day 2, in terms of getting started with Terraform. Then we have Terraform Enterprise, which is typically where most of the Global 2000, Fortune 500 companies end up investing in. And this allows you to bring a private instance of the Terraform Enterprise software into your own environment. You can run custom operations, and it allows you all access to all of the capabilities that we discussed today, and then also support. All right, so that's going to actually wrap up today's webinar. I'll just briefly run through this as a recap. So Terraform is that foundation of the provisioning layer. We have Vault for security. We have Console for connecting and addressing networking concerns. And then Nomad is the workload orchestration and application deployment tool that runs across the top. Sentinel runs across all of these. So policy as code is a component of the suite as well. If you want to find out anything more We have a number of resources. So if you want to go read about the cloud operating model from the HashiCorp perspective, and then a little bit more about the provisioning component, there's some white papers online. If you want to try out Terraform Cloud, you can go to app.terraform.io, and there'll be a workflow to go ahead and sign up and get an org created today. And then there is curriculum and a whole workflow that can get you up and running with Terraform at learn.hashicorp.com/Terraform. And that's a completely free set of curriculum that will walk you through all the workflows, give you code samples, and just get you up and running. If you're kind of past that and you wanted to reach out and find out more about any of our stuff, you can reach out to the HashiCorp team and someone will be happy to talk to you.
All right, that concludes today's webinar. Thank you everyone for joining, and look out for a follow-up email from us.